Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. We have students all over the world, including a colleague of yours, an Australian who is currently in Iraq working for a humanitarian aid organization. So he'll be very happy to hear your accent. And we have with us today, we are very lucky to have Stuart French from Melbourne, Australia. And we're going to start today just by asking him to tell us a little bit about his biography, his background, and then he's going to talk about Agile methodology, and then he's going to tell us anything else that he thinks might be of interest to you. So we'll go with that. So Stuart, thank you so much. And I apologize again for the mix-up, and I'm so glad you're here. Thank you for coming.
That's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So tell us a little bit, Stuart, about how you got into KM and what your background is.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, I'm coming to you from Wurundjeri country in Victoria. The Wurundjeri Indigenous people held lands from where I am here in the outskirts of Melbourne, right about 150 miles down the coast to a small country area where I grew up in Gippsland. And they are an amazing people. They have a great story about the wedge-tailed eagle, which is one of the largest eagles in the world, and their sort of creator spirit is the spirit of that eagle. In the singing, in the storyline of the wedge-tail, is a song map. So, Aboriginals didn't have maps like we have maps, like a satellite view. They held maps in terms of the story walking through the landscape, and they recorded some of those in the sort of artwork that I'm wearing today. One of which is the journey of the Yarra River, and if you want to Google this, you can pull up Melbourne on the map, and you'll see that the Yarra River is our main river through the city. There's Dights Falls, which is up in Kew. It winds around through the CBD, under the Westgate Bridge, and into what's called Port Phillip Bay before emptying into the sea. But here's the thing. The Indigenous people storyline goes from Dights Falls all the way to the Heads. Now, the last time Port Phillip Bay was empty was 3,800 years ago. So scientists think that either they had the ability to pass on that knowledge through 60 odd generations, or they had submarines and sonar. We're not sure which. The point is that we talk about KM since the 90s and how we're storing this information and all that sort of stuff. Our Indigenous people have been making fools of us for thousands of years. They really are amazing, because managing knowledge for them isn't a thing. It's not something they go to university for. It's part of their culture. It's what they live. And so I was working in oil and gas as an apprentice back 30 years ago. And I did computers and radio. We were doing a lot of offshore support for the rigs in Bass Strait, the oil rigs. And they were trialing back then a thing called expert systems. How do we capture the knowledge of our experts, especially around safety systems and our turbines? So, because they're both very important, and when they go wrong, things can catch on fire. So you don't want them to go wrong. And they're also quite expensive to install and maintain. And you don't want to be beholden to these, contractor companies that charge hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Yeah.
And so they've developed these expert systems, question, answer, store all that. And it just was a colossal failure, really. It was really hard. Turns out it's not easy to capture what people know. And so even though I did my apprenticeship in electronics and all that sort of stuff, and then moved into management and all sorts of other things along my journey, the thing that stuck in my head was, why is it so hard to capture this expertise knowledge when I just went through a 4-year apprenticeship, which was the most amazing knowledge transfer experience I've ever had? And I hate to say it, but despite all of our great knowledge management experts around the world, we're still failing behind the trades. Most of our plumbers and electricians and carpenters get a better knowledge transfer training than almost any university on the planet. And why is that? Well, I think it's because in universities, and I know when I did my master's degree, I struggled with this. We kind of artificially separate theory and practice. And that's amazingly powerful to do because you get to look at sort of knowledge in a laboratory space and think about it, you know, theoretically. But the problem with splitting those two is that's not how the human brain works. That's not how we remember stuff. It's not how we understand and recall. And so when you talk to, say, our firefighters, and by the way, I ended up being a consultant and work in the medical waste industry and medical safety products and shipping and finance, and I've been all over the place. It's been a great journey, and that's one of the really cool things, by the way, about being a knowledge manager. It doesn't really matter what sector you're in, as long as they're not using robots. As long as they're still using humans, I've got a job.
Right.
Uh, and it's amazing how much transfers between industries when it comes to people management. And I don't mean HR, I mean actually managing the expertise and knowledge of people, to how they do the job, how they create value. And so I've always had an interest in that. And it's funny that I did my apprenticeship, but the real thing I got out of my apprenticeship was the knowledge sharing part. How do you enculturate people into knowledge systems, not just write stuff down or stick it in a database? And so I've tried through my career to sort of build some of that in, and I try and use modern terms for that. I don't talk about the guilds. I talk about collaboration and complexity and those sorts of more sort of academic terms to help people get their head around what knowledge sharing's like. But really, Kendra, if I could just take everyone back to my apprenticeship and let them experience those 4 years, that would be better than all the talking at conferences and everything I do, because it's it's hard to write that stuff down. You know, Dave Snowden talks about this actually when he was a young person in knowledge management. He got put on the tail of a senior engineer. You know, this happens a lot in KM. You write down everything that guy knows, right? Dr. Kate Andrews in Australia is amazing in this space. And I think she's speaking at KM Asia later this year in October. So if you get a chance to get to Indonesia, to Bali, to that conference, come and listen to Kate Andrews. She's incredible.
Okay.
So Dave was on the tail of this engineer. 6 weeks he followed him around, asked him questions, wrote down everything this guy knew. All of a sudden they got a phone call. They had to go out to an oil rig to respond to a problem. Now this I've remembered this story because I used to work on oil rigs, and they get there. The helicopter's landed on the platform and is spooling down. This engineer's got the door open and one leg out and is just sitting there. And Dave's like, "What are you doing?" And the engineer says, "Listen, it's the main separator. The overpressure valve's going. I know exactly what the problem is." And
Oh.
Dave's like, wait a minute. I followed you for 6 weeks. Not once have you mentioned that listening is a diagnostic technique, right? This was Dave's first aha moment.
Yeah.
So, knowledge isn't just stuff it's not information you've remembered, right? We have whole sections of our brain. I'm sure you've experienced this. Whole sections of our brain that are basically asleep. They're shut down, and then suddenly we smell something, or we run into somebody down the street, or we hear a song, and boom, that whole part of our brain lights up, and all of a sudden we're like, I really feel like a game of Scrabble, because that's what we did with our grandmother when that music was playing. And do you know what you've experienced this, right?
Oh, yeah, 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 absolutely. When I smell a certain brand of cigar that my grandfather smoked, I am back. I am 8 years old playing crazy eights with him in cards.
Exactly right. So knowledge works that way everywhere, not just for our personal memories, the way we lay our expertise down. We we see something that triggers and away we go. Gary Klein talks wonderfully about this stuff. He's got a great book on intuition, and it taps into this some of this stuff. And it's really important to get past these old dynamics of conscious and subconscious. It's neural, right? It's all messed up together, and we need to get away from trying to explain this massively complex thing that the brain is in these simple constructs. It just doesn't help. In fact, it blinds us. to the way it actually works. So it's a
Be
lot more
careful, I've
messy.
written about the subconscious.
There you go. So look, and I talk about right brain, left brain. We're all guilty of this stuff, but I have to keep reminding myself um, that we need to be aware of some of the limitations we put on ourselves when we use these simplifications to explain these ideas to others.
Right.
The data, no, what is it? Data, information, knowledge, wisdom pyramid thing.
Yeah, yeah. DIKW.
Two knowledge experts like you and me, we can talk about that, no problem at all. But if you use that to talk to a manager, I guarantee they will use that to simplify, and they'll have somebody writing a database in 3 weeks. They just can't help themselves.
Yeah, right,
It's a terrible. DIKW is so terrible. SECI is the same thing. Between knowledge experts, SECI is a great tool, but don't talk to somebody outside knowledge management about it, because they will take that the wrong way and just think, oh, okay, so we just take tacit knowledge and we write it down.
right,
Oh my gosh. So a lot of this stuff for me when it comes to knowledge management has been a journey to find out, how do we help people individually, as teams, and then as managers, as leaders, to create these knowledge spaces that create value over time. So they self-replicate, they take care of succession planning, they transfer useful practice across time and space,
right,
and they do so on a self-replicating basis. So whether that's embedded in the things we do, in the processes we use, in the systems that we automate with, in the way our processes are designed and interdesigned, so that we build these systems. And a huge part of that for me is, how do you do that without creating the barriers? There's this amazing lady, Madeline Albright, right? Which is
oh
your
yeah,
name. Is,
yeah.
is she like a cousin of yours or something?
No, no relation, I wish.
So she said, every, I'm paraphrasing here, but she said every night light in every capital city in the world is on tonight, trying to solve a problem that was a solution to the previous set of problems.
Hmm.
I love that saying. That's such an important quote,
It
because
is.
it's so easy to go into problem solving mode, whether it's business, whether it's emergency management, whether it's designing something, and we don't think about the unintended consequences. Now, that's natural. None of us are geniuses, none of us have perfect knowledge, but they don't design their systems to allow these threats and weaknesses to be shown, to reveal themselves and to be responded to. They just leave that, they kick the can down the road. And so for me, knowledge management has been very much about learning how to manage better, how to get the most out of the incredible knowledge and expertise our people hold, and to pass that on to the next generation without triggering those blockers, those barriers
Right.
to knowledge sharing in the process.
That's
But
really
that's a bit
interesting.
about me. I live in the beautiful Dandenongs, just outside Melbourne. I have a big mountain right across the road from me. I have wallabies and deer coming out on cold nights, and it's a beautiful place to live, and have my family here. But I do come from the country, so I like to get back there as well.
Do you have to slap your bedroom slippers together to get the spiders out?
You know, we only talk to you Americans about spiders and snakes just to scare you, right? It's not that bad. I
Yeah.
mean, scientifically, it is true that I'm within 5 meters of a spider right now. It's just is. But they're like tiny. Don't worry about them. It's
I
only the shiny ones you've got to worry about anyway. You know that, right? The
the
furry
black.
ones are fine. They don't bite.
Yeah, same here. The black widows are all very shiny.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Great. So now, so you got into this, and this is where you're very interested in is understanding that whole process about knowledge transfer. Does that relate then to the Agile methodology?
Absolutely. So, yeah, so relates. So, I we have things like Scaled Agile and Scrum and Kanban, and there's all these different Agile approaches, none of which I'm particularly wedded to. The thing I love about Agile is actually the manifesto itself. So the idea that we look at individuals over interactions. We try and create working solutions. I know it started off as working software, but I see Agile as much more than just software design.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, we collaborate with our customers and we respond to change. And when you put those last two together, what that has given me in the KM space
Hmm.
is the ability to think about the way humans and technologies interact. And what I mean by that is people do funny things when their circumstances change. Yeah. A good example is we had a freeway that came from out of the city of Melbourne, and a Premier Brax, quite a few years ago, said he was going to extend that. So we had a freeway from the country, we had a freeway from the city, and then we just had streets in between the two. They weren't joined. And he said, you know what, we're going to turn that into a freeway. And halfway through the project, they said, oh, we can't afford this. So what we'll do is we'll turn it into a tollway. So they figured, okay, well, we've got, 80,000 cars a morning going along that piece of road. If we charge them $8 for the trip, you multiply that out, that gives you so much money a day in tolls, which would pay off the road in X amount of time. Well, they built the tollway and only 60,000 cars a morning were on the road, weren't they? Because a lot of people didn't want to pay the $8. And
Right. Yeah.
that's a lot of money out of your weekly pay.
Yeah.
So they're just linear thinking, just total linear thinking. They didn't understand they're playing with a dynamic system. And when you change the nature of the system, the people's behaviors are going to correspondingly change in weird ways that you
That's
don't
right.
expect. And so when you're working at knowledge work, you get lots of that, especially when you've got, interacting teams and processes that are both vertical and horizontal. So you
Hmm.
get people changing something and you get these cascades of changing behaviors through the network. And I just don't get how people can watch that happen time and time again and still apply linear change, approaches. Whereas Agile allows you to co-evolve your solution space, which is, in KM is often a technology space.
Hmm.
Not always, but
Right.
co-evolve that with the understanding and the behaviors of your people, because that involves their personal lives, their resources or lack thereof, the processes they work under that are going to be triggered more unbeknownst to you because you changed that process, and all of a sudden you've got it. Well, if you can co-evolve those, then you can keep adaptively changing your design to meet the new needs as they appear from your people, right? Likewise, opportunities are going to present themselves where people are actually only doing that because of a problem. So if you can actually remove that problem by adding that to your design, all of a
Uh,
sudden the whole wave function that holds that set of behaviors in place collapses. And the problem, you don't have to solve the problem because it's not a problem anymore.
right.
I hope I'm not talking too technical.
No,
You get
no,
the
no.
idea,
I'm
right?
thinking of
That
many different cases where I've seen this happen. Yeah.
Yeah. So for me, Agile is about a learning approach to design. How are we going to solve this problem? And who are the stakeholders involved? How do they interact with one another? What are the pressures on each of them? And what are the desires of each of them? How can I make them look good in front of their bosses and in front of the board? And how can I consistently keep the focus on creating value for the end customer? In our case, that's the communities that we serve, our mission is to save lives and property from fire. And
Right.
so I don't have a customer, I don't have a profit motive. I've got lives that I need to see saved. I've got people that need to be dragged out of car wrecks or saved from burning buildings. And preferably they get out before we get there. Before the truck arrives, everybody in the house, especially the kids, have been evacuated. Yeah. So we do things like deliver, um, we call them smoke alarms. I'm not sure what you
Yeah,
call them.
yeah,
They're
we
things
do.
on the roof.
Same.
Yeah.
Yeah, smoke.
And so the new ones now can be hardwired in,
Yeah.
right? They still have a little battery, so if you have a power outage, they still work for a little while. And they're Wi-Fi connected to one another, which means when one goes off, they all go off. So the whole family gets woken up.
Okay.
And which means now we're encouraging people, put them in your bedrooms,
Uh-huh.
have a smoke alarm in your bedroom, right?
Yep.
I was talking to a person in a fire brigade the other day from a heavy um, anti-union regional area. And so they don't like the full-time firefighters. They're volunteers. By the way, CFA is a volunteer firefighting organisation,
Yeah.
55,000 volunteers. We're the third most volatile fire state in the world. So the south
Yes.
of Spain
Yes.
is the word. Then California, then
Yeah.
us.
Yeah.
And it sounds weird because we're not in the hot part of Australia. We're down at the bottom, right? We're in
Right.
the cool part, but uh, we're in this perfect zone where you've got enough coolness and wetness in the winter to grow lush forests and lots of vegetation, and then enough heat, around 40 degrees in the summer, which is around 103,
Oh,
104 Fahrenheit, I think.
uh, 40 degrees centigrade would be
Yeah.
more like 80, 90.
80, 90? Right.
Yeah, 80 or
So we
80.
get that through the summer, quite dry.
Yeah, it's hot, hot and
It's hot
dry.
and low humidity. So that dries all that vegetation out and creates fuel. And when it comes to fire, it's all about fuel load, right?
Yeah.
So that's why we've got so many thousands of volunteers. We have running grass fires, we have forest fires through the
Yeah.
mountains. It's an issue, and it's not something that happens all the time. But when it happens, hundreds of people can die. We had
Right.
270 people die in 2009,
Yeah, I
and so
remember seeing it on the news. Yeah.
yeah, it was terrible. It was terrible. But the thing is, for me as a knowledge manager, what do I do at CFA? So at CFA, there's a saying that a tree hasn't changed the way it burns down in 150,000 years, right? Which is largely true, except it's not anymore. In 2019, during the large fires, the 7 million hectare fires, we saw 40-meter flame heights on a 23-degree day, which is like 56 degrees, I think, in Fahrenheit.
Yeah.
The
It's
40-meter flame height, no
yeah.
one's seen that before. We had 80-year-old firefighters saying they've never heard even their father or their grandfathers talking about flame behavior like this on such cool days.
Yeah.
And so climate change, you won't find many climate deniers as firefighters,
Yeah.
right? They don't know anything about the science, but they're seeing what's happening in our forests.
Yeah.
And so we are needing to now get more agile. We're needing to think, okay, what if trees do burn differently than they did 150,000 years ago,
Right.
which is like 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And so what does responding to that look like? Well, one of the good stories that came out of those fires was that New South Wales Fire Service, which is the largest volunteer organisation in Australia, by the way, they got very good at resetting doctrine. And so they would actually learn from each mini fire, and then the stuff that worked, they would transfer to the others. And
Yeah.
they did that via a couple of different methods. Now that's awesome. It's just a pity it took such a massive emergency for that behavior to be allowed. So what I'm trying to do is to bring those sorts of behaviors, which we did beautifully during that emergency, and make that a part of our staple, a part of our knowledge diet within the organization, that we're constantly saying, hey, this worked well, or this didn't work well.
Right. Right. Right.
And so that's a big part of what we're doing. Now, how do you do that? Well, you need to listen to the people on the ground and not try and do the big design thing, the waterfall design. I'm going to research this really well, and then I'm going to write the perfect design, and then we're going to develop it and deliver it, and everyone's going to love it. Well, I don't know what planet that ever worked on. I know for large projects, it's kind of the way you need to do it, but uh, uh, and all the safe people are screaming at me right now. I know, because they're saying, no, there's an agile way to do that too. But for me, it's not about the technique, right? I don't care which style of agile is there. Are you walking the talk? Because some of the new agile stuff you'll come across, and I'm talking to the students now, just have your thinking hat on, right? Some of this stuff is as doctrinated and as entrenched in its processes as the previous waterfall and design processes were, right? The pre-design thinking stuff. And so you find yourself saying agile, but actually doing something that is completely anti-agile. You're
Right.
no longer responding to the need of the customer as it emerges in front of you because you're in this massive design phase, right? And
Right.
so just be aware of that. Keep that about you. If you're designing a space shuttle or something, fine, then you use whatever techniques NASA tells you to. But you're a knowledge manager. You're responsible for staying in that creative space
Mhm.
and asking those hard philosophical questions of, hold on, do we really know that this approach is going to create this output, which is going to influence this outcome? Do we really know that? And if we don't, let's flip into agile and let's test some ideas. Let's probe the space, right? If you know Dave Snowden's work on Cynefin, you're now in the complex space you don't know. And so you probe, you sense, and you respond. So what are your senses? How are you detecting what is and isn't working? How are you understanding how your people are transforming and adjusting their behaviors around the new design you've put in? I'll give
Yeah.
you an example. We have a new project at the moment, which I'm helping run, that is going to put a mobile app on every firefighter's smartphone. Our firefighters are largely farmers, plumbers, tradies, people from regional areas, shop owners, postmasters, real people doing real work and real jobs. And no offense to my city academic friends. Um, And so these people traditionally aren't huge on technology, and it's hard just to get them to read the doctrine book. But at the same time, government compliance is increasing all the time, whether it's records compliance or safety or child safety. Child safety is a huge one. Privacy. These things aren't easy anymore, and the government is implementing these new legislations completely assuming that you're implementing technologies to automate these things.
Right.
The government's not expecting you to be walking around with bits of dead tree and burnt carbon and writing in them with stuff,
Right.
right? That's not how, but that's how we still work as a fire service. I
Right.
was at an executive meeting the other day with a lot of high level people. There was two computers in the room. Everyone else had a logbook that they were writing in. Right? That is completely standard for fire services, paid or volunteer. And so, how do we do this app? Well, there's lots we can do. Number one, we bring it to assist them to do what they do. We have a difference between what we call, uh, um, firefighting mode, which um, Daniel Kahneman talks about, system one and system two thinking. Well, this is the type of thinking where you're standing in front of a house that's on fire and you've just been told there's two kids inside, right? You're
Right.
not you're not Googling anything.
Right.
You've got what knowledge is in here. You've got what your team has got. If you've got time to listen to them, you're doing your size up. You're telling your people, okay, I need 2 lines for 2 lengths each. I need a monitor set up there. I need someone up on that hill to see if we can breach the roof space. And I need 2 people through that front door right now.
Right.
And so, uh, what does my app do? Well, okay, you're in there, you rescue the 2 kids, but you find out the house is full of asbestos.
Oh, gee.
Oh, gee, asbestos. Okay, everyone get the masks on. I know there's 9 steps to the asbestos thing. I remember 7 of them. Okay, now you're no longer in that moment where you have to firefight. Pull this thing out, look up the 9 steps. The
Right.
long safety of your team depends on you getting those 9 steps
Right.
right.
Right. Yep.
Yeah. So there's that. The second part, and this is the coevolution, the agile part, is we are putting full monitoring, usage analytics into the app. I want to know every button click, every page view, how long they were on it, by who. So we're not going to track individuals, but that individual user ID gets sent back to an API we have, which pulls out what their role was, what district they're from, whether they're a volunteer or full time, and their age range. So we know whether they're an older person or a younger person.
Right.
The GPS data, we're going to track, are they standing still? Are they walking? Are
Oh, wow.
they in a vehicle? Okay, then they throw the ID away. So we don't know who they were, but we
Right,
have
right.
that data around that piece of information was accessed in this condition. And so we want to watch this. And the reason I'm so really full on about this usage tracking is we have a real danger, and we've seen this with young people, where the technology becomes a crutch. It actually turns off the learning centers of the
Yep.
mind
Yep.
because I don't need to remember that. It's in my phone.
Right.
Well, as a firefighter, you can't do that. You need to know what you need to know when you're standing in front of that building. You don't get the chance to pull out and call a friend. And so it needs to be there as a resource, as a reference. But we really want to monitor to make sure it doesn't replace the knowledge our firefighters need to learn and hold and do the work to have that in RAM right when they need to go. So that's an example of how we're using Agile, because what's the design, Kendra? What's the design that gives us that good outcome but avoids the bad outcome?
Right, right, right,
Nobody knows, right?
right. And
No
you
amount of
test,
design would find out.
and you test it to make sure that you don't deal with those, or that you don't create unintended consequences that create more problems. Yeah. Okay.
Sort of. I mean, we will. We
But
will create unintended consequences. The question isn't avoiding that. The question is, are you looking for them? Are
yeah,
you ready to respond? Have you designed the product in a way that you can quickly pivot to
right.
take those into account? That's for me. Everyone's about this perfect design. You'll never achieve it. That's the
Well,
whole idea of Agile.
I think that's a really important point you made earlier about the unintended consequences, because I think that, yeah, I think you're right. You are going to get those. The question is, how do you handle those? How do you address those? How do you recognize them? Because I think that from what you're describing, in getting people to just, kind of abandon their academic training, for lack of a better way, and just think, for themselves, what we used to call, real schooling, reading, writing, and arithmetic, right? So you just have to think about what's really going on and getting out of that mindset that most of the younger generations who have come up with computers, or they don't have to remember things. They don't have to remember, how to do math. They can just plug it into a calculator. And that's not what you need. You need somebody who's going to think, because you got to have somebody that can put it all together in a really quick way and then provide the support that you need for that. I used to do expert systems with knowledge acquisition myself. So yeah, yeah, I hear what you're saying. Yeah.
So we're looking now at the next stage of KM being very heavily backed by AI, and this is an area that's going to need to be looked at. So
Yeah.
what are the unintended consequences of switching over to AI in a lot of these areas? And I
Terminator.
think no, I just wrote a blog post about this on my deltaknowledge.net blog, if you're interested. But
I am.
the
Yeah.
the for me, I think KM is becoming more important, not less important.
Mhm.
AI won't replace us. AI will replace and automate a lot of those basic knowledge roles that are, the accountants and the lawyers and the stuff that you can just plug in and plug out of. Um, and I don't mean the lawyers in the courtroom. I mean the poor old lawyers in the back room doing the 90% of the research before the court case starts, right? A lot of that library work will disappear overnight. I know in India they're talking about 13-year backlog of court cases,
Oh
100,
gosh. Probably here
um,
too.
I can't remember the numbers, but massive numbers, 500 different jurisdictions with different laws in each one. And 90% of the time, case preparation is done through looking, just working out what the local laws apply in this case. And that can all be automated with AI. But the thinking part, the people who are running the law firms, the people who are
Right.
designing the court approaches and attacks and how they're going to navigate it, that stuff is going to become more and more important, not because it's special, but because it'll just take up a larger and larger space of your corporate capability, because all this stuff has been automated by AI, right? So these are the people that knowledge management works with. They're the ones that carry the deep expertise that
Right,
knowledge managers are here to help.
right.
This is about writing stuff down. And so I think KM has a really important part to play. So we need to keep our seat at the table. We need to keep that outcomes focused.
Yeah,
Don't get so caught up on some of the nice to dos of KM that theory says we should be looking at, but keep the focus on the end result. So, just as an example of that, I guess this is about being a knowledge manager for me. Wherever I go, I get involved. I've sat in rubbish trucks driving around Toronto and Niagara. I've I've signed up as a volunteer firefighter and been a firefighter for 3.5 years to learn. Because how can you be a knowledge manager and not understand what knowledge is critical for the people you're trying to help?
yeah,
I've worked as a lawyer. I've never done any law, but I've worked as a in a lawyer job inside a financial firm
wow,
doing the competency work for 4.5 months. That was in order to design an automation that would help embed the key knowledge that those people had to avoid fraud and money laundering. Yeah, so we embedded that into a system, 73-step system, the process that they had to take
yeah,
each person through. And we didn't just make a checkbox of 73 steps. We actually created a system that embedded the knowledge of those lawyers in how they know, because no one will tell you that they're fraudulent, right?
right,
It's where you ask them for their ABN certificate, the Australian Business Number certificate, or their corporate paperwork, and there's a 3-day delay before they give it to you. That was one of the triggers that people would go, "That's weird. It's hanging on my wall. Let me just scan it for you." Right? That's not 3 days.
yeah,
So they had this sort of red mark system in their head. So we talked with them over the 4 months, and we made that explicit. We were like, "Well, why? Why do you have this bad feeling about that person?" And they're like, "I don't know. It wouldn't surprise me if he's a bad egg." And so you look through and you work backwards through that. Okay, what data have you looked at for them? And we went through, oh, well, we're up to step 26, and step 13, this happened. And it doesn't normally work like that. And then step 14, he sent me the wrong thing. Now, I called him and he sent me the right thing straight away. But I wonder if he would have done that if I hadn't called him on it, right? And each one of these things is a little red mark. So the system created a red mark system where these behaviors were identified. So a brand new lawyer coming into the company would normally take around 10 to 12 weeks to get up to speed to where the customer couldn't tell the difference between them and an old timer, right? We got that from 12 weeks down to 8 days. Within
wow.
8 days to competency, a new lawyer was indistinguishable from an old expert.
Yep, yep. That makes perfect sense. That's really excellent. And I can see how the old notion of expert systems, this really builds on that and really helps to understand how you can truly do what we in the old days tried to do with expert systems, but just could never make it. They just couldn't do it. So this is a really great approach. So yeah, that's wonderful. I have to tell you a real quick story. I did research in Uganda for many years trying to understand why they were so successful at reversing the prevalence of HIV/AIDS through behavior change caused by what they attributed it to as an information, education, and communication strategy. And so we studied this for 6 years, and I can tell you how they did it. But it's like you're backing into the Agile methodology. They had something that worked, but if you look at how they did it, it was all the pieces that you have described about overcoming barriers and responding to certain ways and building that grid you talked about earlier. You have horizontal and vertical communication processes and conduits, and getting them to all work at the same time together which was just a stroke of luck in so many ways, it would be really hard to think about how, and the cultural aspects of it. It would be hard to imagine that they could do that today. But that's that's a story for another day, and it would be interesting to apply what we learned and use an agile methodology and see if we could make it work. But nonetheless, we don't need to because we have antiretrovirals now. This was before that. So
Yeah, for sure.
yeah, so it was a backing into what did they do that was right? How did they do that? And it was really interesting. Yeah, like we found that the two most common ways that they shared knowledge about HIV/AIDS, besides interpersonal, because they're an oral tradition, like you were talking about your indigenous peoples there. You know, Africa's very much about storytelling through song and dance, and there's lots of AIDS song and dance. But the two ways they disseminated AIDS information in Uganda were radio, not surprising, and drama, because they put plays
Yep.
on all over the place.
That doesn't surprise me. Narrative is huge. I did some work in South Africa with 300 Zulus in one of the factories we were working in, and we installed some robotics there, and I had to do the training, and I just loved working with Zulus. If I ever get the chance again, I'll jump at it because they were the most amazing people, the best knowledge sharing culture I've ever seen on the planet. The owners of the company had worked this out. They said there was 3 nodes, and I said, "What's a node?" And they said, "Oh no, it's 3 people in
Right,
the network of their tribe, right?" So if they've got a safety message, they put it up on the board because the government says they have to have a notice board, but no one reads the notice board. They tell these 3 people, and within 20 minutes,
right.
all 300 know about it.
That's right. That's
And
right.
I said, how do you, wait a minute, we have this thing too, and we call that was it Chinese whispers, where it, each person it goes to, the story changes a little bit.
A telephone game is what we call it. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So I asked them about that, and they said, "Oh no, you don't understand. We're in Zulu culture. Our reputation with one another in telling the truth is part of our membership of the tribe. Okay, we get the story right, and not just that. When you hear the story, a new story, the first time, you don't believe it. You hold it, and then when you hear it again, because it's traveling all ways through the network, and then you triangulate on the 2 stories you hold, and then when you
Yeah.
hear it the third time, now you know."
Right. 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 Right.
But us Western thinkers are like, yeah, but how many weeks does that take? No, 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 20 minutes.
Right.
And you've got people doing this quite difficult technical work next to this robot, 4 of them in a row, and they're talking. No less than 2 people talking at any time, all talking to each other, and they're all listening. So I don't know how their brains work. It's amazing, but they've done it since birth, right? It's
Yeah.
the way
Yeah.
they work, and it's the most beautiful culture. It's wonderful.
It is.
Yeah, and I took a lot from that time in, okay, how do we get our people to transfer knowledge that way, where it's just part of what we naturally do. And in the fire services, we have that. So
That's
you can't stand still at a fire station more than 5 minutes without somebody telling you a story or teaching you something. It's the most wonderful thing. The problem we have is it's a little too tribal. So if we learn something that works really well, then getting that to the other end of the state is really hard because it's all verbal.
wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
don't talk to each other online. They don't talk to each other digitally. So how do I capture and transfer that?
Give them
And
drums.
yeah,
African drumming.
drumming, smoke signals.
Smoke
Should
signals.
get it
Yeah.
going.
Yeah.
So this is the creative side of KM that I love. I mean, this is why I love my job because
Yeah.
I every day I go to work, I'm doing something different. I
Yeah.
run the lessons team at CFA, the Lessons Management Center, and that's an awesome team. And they do some wonderful work with lessons learned, after action reviews, after major incidents. I was at one the other day. We had a major bus rollover, bus truck accident,
Ooh.
40 kids in the bus, really traumatic. And the way they responded to that was amazing, really incredible. The
Wow.
way CFA then responded to our people with peer support, mental health, making sure everyone's okay.
Yep.
Um, just wonderful. Really, so proud of our organisation, the way it handles things like that, the way it interfaces with the community, and the way it prioritises when the cards are really down. You know, when
Right.
it's when everyone's running away, we're running in, and I'm so
Right.
proud of them for that. It's fantastic.
Yeah. And oh, that's great. That's really, really a great story. Yeah. And I also really like the 60 generations of storytelling from what did you call the people? I got, which,
The Zulu, 60 generations. Yeah,
the,
uh, the Aboriginal people. So they're
yeah.
the Wurundjeri people, Aboriginals in southeastern Victoria. And so we have hundreds and hundreds of different Indigenous tribes across
Yeah.
Australia,
Yeah. Yeah.
many different language groups. The Wurundjeri people are part of the Kulin Nation, so um, uh, uh, not as not as clearly dealt with as happened in America's past, where you had reservations and that sort of stuff. But we did have things like that.
Yeah.
Lake Tyers was where a lot of the Wurundjeri people and Healesville, those two areas especially.
Uh,
Um, so it wasn't a wholesale sweeping, but we had a whole lost generation thing. We're quite a shameful past with the way we've treated our Indigenous
uh,
people. And they
we're
were
not
only recognised as human beings in Australia in I think 1967. So
right.
that's not that long ago, guys.
I
That's
know.
so we've got a lot of making up to do, but they have a lot to teach us about fire as well. And I know we're coming to the end of time, but this is
Yep.
probably a good way to end it and close the circle.
All
Is
right.
we as a knowledge manager, I'm constantly coming up against the barriers, the artificial barriers created by KPIs. Management loves their KPIs nowadays. If it's measurable and
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
it's great. And I'm seeing you nodding your head there, Kendra. I know uh, Albert Einstein said, not all things that matter can be measured, and not all things that can be measured matter. And that is such a true statement. So we, as Westerners, of course, take a scientific approach to fire. And I even used the language earlier in this talk when I mentioned fuel load. So we see vegetation as fuel. In other words, how many calories are there to burn? And is it 12 tons an acre, or is it 400 tons an acre of fuel?
Yeah.
What we forget is Aboriginals have been around 60 to 80,000 years on this continent. There is no natural nature in Australia.
Hmm.
Bottom to top, Australia is a garden.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was created by Aboriginals to manage the species that benefited the wildlife, that benefited them, that reduced the risk of fire, that increased abundance of food supplies, that created tracts of forest land and the various diversity of species that they lived with. And we come along and we just reduce all of that to number of calories, number of kilojoules of energy. It's so sad. We have so much to learn from them. They live in complexity. They think and breathe complexity of the land, and they treat the land as a thing. I was listening the other day. I think $24. The First Nations people sold Manhattan for,
Yeah. Something like
because
that.
the idea of actually owning land is crazy. It's like, would you like to buy some sky too? We can sell
Right.
that too.
Right. Right.
It's just the most crazy idea, and yet we come along and the unintended consequences that have come out of some of those things. Now, I'm not saying it's wrong that we own land, but we need to just check ourselves and be asking those questions. And in a lot of the cases, it's the knowledge manager in the room that's challenging those assumptions, that's asking the polite but sometimes difficult questions that get
Right.
people to rethink and reassign. Because in the end, we're not going to be the CEO. We're not going to be the major decision makers. It's our job to change. We don't get to control the eyeballs. We get to control the neck.
Right.
We can turn the neck. Our
Right.
questions, our search engines, the data and information we make available to the decision makers, that turns the neck and guides the organization in sustainable ways.
Right.
And when you think about it that way, knowledge managers have a huge responsibility on our shoulders, and I take that very, very
Mhm.
seriously.
Yeah.
And I hope you do too.
I do. And I know you have to go right now, but thank you, Stuart. This has been exceptional. Please let me know when you have more time. I have other things that I wanted to talk with you about, and we will do that. I so appreciate you taking your time. We learned a lot. Thank you so much, Stuart.
My pleasure. Great talking to you, Kendra. I look forward to catching up again.
Thank you.